The gates of Buckingham Palace remained closed, the balcony empty, and a subdued silence had fallen over the monarchy. For 3 long months, the nation navigated a strange, anxious rhythm. Hospital bulletins instead of royal walkabouts, worried speculation instead of ceremonial smiles. The relentless machinery of the crown had, for once, ground to a hushed halt, forced to bow before a common and formidable foe, cancer. 2 of its most pivotal figures, the King and the Princess of Wales, had stepped into the private battle of their lives, leaving behind a palace of whispers and a public holding its breath. Now, as spring strained to break through a lingering chill, a single, confirmed message from the palace ignited a flame of hope. They were coming back. But the people wondered, as the first glimmer of royal gold appeared on the horizon. Were they returning as the sovereign and future queen they remembered, or as 2 people forever changed by the shadow they had walked through? The early April sun struggled to warm the gray stone of Buckingham Palace. Behind its famous gates, a flurry of quiet, purposeful activity was underway, different from the pomp of a state visit or the frenzy of a trooping the color. This was preparation of a more delicate kind. In the private apartments, King Charles sat by a window, a blanket across his knees. He looked thinner, the lines on his face etched a little deeper, but his eyes, fixed on the daffodils in the garden below, held a quiet clarity. The past months had been a brutal education in vulnerability. The relentless fatigue of treatment, the loss of control, the sudden mundanity of being a patient. It had stripped away the layers of ritual that always surrounded him. He had missed the weight of the dispatch boxes, the scent of old paper in the archives, the predictable rhythm of duty. But, in their absence, he had found something unexpected. Long, uninterrupted hours to think, to read, to simply be with his wife. The world had seen a king in hiatus. He had, for the first time in his 75 years, experienced something perilously close to an ordinary life, albeit one framed by fear and medical routine. Across the palace, in a sun-filled drawing room that felt more like a family space than a stateroom, Catherine, Princess of Wales, practiced the art of stillness. Her recovery had been a slower, more internal journey. The physical toll of her preventative treatment had been immense, but the psychological journey had been its own marathon. The fierce need to protect her young children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, from the full brunt of the storm had been her anchor. She had focused on them, on simple routines of homework and bedtime stories, using their normalcy as her compass. Yet, the pressure of the world's gaze, even in her absence, was a palpable weight. The wild rumors, the invasive speculation, it had felt like a second illness to combat. She had spent hours walking the frost-kissed paths of the Windsor estate, not as a princess, but as a woman grappling with her own mortality. The woman who had stepped back into the light was not the same as the one who had retreated. There was a new steel in her resilience, a profound appreciation for the unscripted, silly moments with her family that no camera would ever capture. Her return was not about picking up a diary. It was about redefining what that diary and her life within it would mean. The palace's senior advisors moved between them like careful diplomats, balancing concern with necessity. The first engagements were chosen with the precision of a surgeon. No long walks, no crowded rooms, no exhausting foreign tours. A short, seated audience with the Prime Minister for the King. A visit to a children's hospice for Catherine, a cause close to her heart, where the environment was controlled and the emotions genuine. The message was to be one of gratitude, not grandeur. The communications team drafted statements that spoke of incremental steps and kind thoughts, carefully managing expectation. The monarchy, an institution built on the spectacle of continuity, was about to showcase a different strength, the courage of fragility. The night before the first announced appearance, Charles dined quietly with Camilla. He spoke not of treaties or titles, but of the overwhelming wave of letters from fellow cancer patients he had read, their shared stories of hope and setback. Catherine video called her parents, her voice steady as she talked about the children's excitement at her new job of getting better. In their separate quarters, both understood the paradox. Their greatest duty now was to be convincingly themselves, human beings who had been through a fire, returning to serve not as invincible figureheads, but as living proof of a battle ongoing. The morning of the king's first official return dawned clear and bright. He stood for a long time as his valet helped him into his suit, the familiar fabric hanging slightly looser on his frame. The significance of the tie, the pocket square, the insignia, rituals that had become automatic, now felt deeply intentional. Each piece was a step back into his calling. His arrival at a cancer research center in London was subdued. There was no fanfare, just a small, respectful crowd held back by barriers. As he stepped from the car, he moved a touch slower, but his smile, though weary, was warm and reached his eyes. He did not rush along the line. He stopped, he listened. He shook the hand of an elderly volunteer and held it for a beat longer, a silent communion between two men who knew the same fear. Inside, surrounded by microscopes and petri dishes, he spoke briefly. His voice was softer than before, but it carried a new gravity. Having somewhat recently joined the cohort of those receiving treatment, he said, a slight, wry smile touching his lips, I find myself looking at this work with even more profound admiration and hope. It was a simple sentence, but it shattered the royal we. It was personal. It was I. The cameras captured not just a king at work, but a man on a mission born of personal ordeal. The image that flashed around the world was not one of majestic power, but of empathetic connection. He left not to a booming cheer, but to a respectful, heartfelt applause that seemed to sustain him as he returned to his car. Catherine's return was crafted with her own signature grace. She chose a small, charity-supported preschool in the suburbs, a world away from the marble halls of palaces. She arrived alone, without the buffer of a large team. Dressed in a simple, cheerful dress, her hair down, she looked like any other young mother coming to visit, though perhaps more radiant. The children, too young to understand palaces or princesses, simply saw a kind, smiling lady who got down on the floor with them. She built wobbling towers of blocks, listened to earnest, jumbled stories, and helped a little girl paint a chaotic, wonderful sunflower. For an hour, the only sound was the beautiful, universal noise of children at play. It was only as she was leaving, kneeling to accept a clumsily wrapped bunch of daffodils from a shy 4-year-old, that the emotion of the moment touched her. She blinked rapidly, pulling the child into a gentle hug. Her face turned away from the cameras for a brief, private second. When she stood, her composure was back, but her eyes were bright. "Thank you for having me," she said to the teachers, her voice thick with genuine feeling. "It's been the most wonderful morning." The photographs told a story of pure, unvarnished joy and healing. They showed a woman not performing duty, but rediscovering the world through its simplest, most beautiful interactions. Her return was not an announcement. It was a quiet demonstration of strength, a testament to the healing power of normalcy itself. Back at the palace, the atmosphere had subtly shifted. The silence was no longer one of sickroom anxiety, but of quiet accomplishment and renewed purpose. Charles, back in his study, looked over the photos from Catherine's outing with a father's pride. "She was brilliant," he remarked to an aide, his own morning's fatigue momentarily forgotten. The public reaction was a tidal wave of positive sentiment. Newspapers that had traded in speculation now ran headlines like "The Heart of the Nation" and "Quiet Courage." The narrative had irrevocably changed. They were no longer distant icons caught in a health crisis. They were Charles and Catherine, a father and a mother, grandfather and a daughter-in-law, who had faced a darkness every family fears and were finding their way back into the light, one careful step at a time. Their shared experience, though lived separately, had created an unspoken bond of understanding between them. At a private family dinner that evening, there were no speeches, just the comfortable noise of cutlery and children's laughter. Louis, ever the comedian, mimicked a serious newsreader announcing, "The king is having soup," which made Charles laugh, a real, deep, unguarded laugh that echoed in the room. It was a sound of healing, more powerful than any trumpet fanfare. The institution had survived their absence, but, in their return, it had gained something priceless, a profound human depth. The return was not a full restoration, and everyone understood that. The calendar remained carefully curated, a patchwork of lighter duties interspersed with significant rest. King Charles began to host smaller, more focused receptions at Windsor, championing the causes that had taken on a new, urgent meaning: medical research, palliative care, support for the elderly. His speeches lost some of their formal flourishes and gained a direct, conversational honesty that resonated deeply. He spoke of the kindness of strangers in the form of nurses, the boredom of recovery, and the unexpected gifts of time to reflect. He became a different kind of monarch in waiting for so long, now a monarch profoundly in the moment. The crown seemed to sit differently on his head, not as a weight of destiny, but as a platform for advocacy forged in personal fire. His relationship with the public, once one of respect and tradition, warmed into one of sheer vulnerability and mutual respect. People saw in him their own fathers, their own grandfathers, facing age and illness with grit and grace. For Catherine, the journey continued to be one of integration. She did not rush back to a whirlwind of royal tours. Instead, she deepened her work, particularly around early childhood. Her Shaping Us campaign took on a new, richer texture. She spoke not just as a royal patron, but as a mother who had held her children tight during a frightening time, understanding more than ever the foundational importance of a safe, loving start. She began to host informal roundtables at Kensington Palace, bringing together experts and parents, listening more than she spoke. The polished princess became a compelling convener, her quiet authority born of real lived strength. In her few public appearances, the change was palpable. There was a stillness to her, a lack of urgency to please. Her smiles were slower, more genuine, reaching her eyes in a way that felt entirely her own. The world watched a woman not just recovering her health, but consciously building her legacy, brick by brick, on terms that made sense to her heart and her family. The monarchy itself, in their hands, seemed to exhale a breath it had been holding for decades. The stiff formality that sometimes felt like a barrier began, in small ways, to soften. The first official portrait released after their return showed Charles and Catherine not on a balcony or in a throne room, but in a sun-drenched palace drawing room, surrounded by the vibrant, messy artwork of George, Charlotte, and Louis. It was a calculated image, of course, but it felt true. It spoke of family, of continuity, of life beyond the illness. The story was no longer about cancer. It was about what came after. It was about resilience not as a stiff upper lip cliché, but as a daily, active choice. The palace that had once just confirmed their illness now stood as a backdrop to their remarkable, ongoing recovery. The nation, which had worried and prayed, now watched with a protective, proud affection. Charles and Catherine had not just returned to duty. They had, in the most public and private way possible, returned to themselves, transforming an institution in the process by reminding everyone of the fragile, powerful humanity at its core. The hiatus was over, but the lesson remained, etched into the very fabric of the crown. That true strength often looks not like an unbreakable wall, but like a carefully tended, resilient garden, blooming once more after the hardest of winters.